Well, there is almost nothing worse than being stuck. Being stuck is not a very fun thing. A few years back, we were out on a boat and we went down south of Nassau Bay on Clear Creek. And we had anchored the boat on Clear Creek in a section where there was enough room for water skiers and and wakeboarders to go by. I almost said snowboarders. And we parked the boat kind of to the side and anchored there and just enjoyed it. And we were relaxing. And a little breeze came along and pushed the boat closer to the shore where it got really shallow. And I was nervous about the boat getting in too shallow of water because when we started it up, I didn't want it to damage the propeller and all of that. So I stepped over the side. The little depth gauge said it was about 2 feet deep. And so I stepped over the side. I was wearing flip-flops. And I touched the surface of the ground and discovered that it was mud. And I sunk up to about here. So the water came up to about here. And I was really stuck in the mud at that point. And so I pushed the boat off the bank there, and then I realized I was going to have a very difficult time getting out of that little spot where I was. I mean, you can't really wade when you're up to here in mud. And also I had on my favorite flip-flops, and I didn't want to lose those. So I was trying to manage keeping the flip-flops on my feet and getting out. And so what I ended up having to do is I sort of like laid down on the mud and sort of wiggled my legs out and then kind of swam over to the boat. One of the flip-flops was particularly stuck, and it was so stuck that I just had to really crank up on it. And what happened was the little piece of the flip-flop that goes between the little piggy that went to the market and the one that stayed home, it broke. And so and when I got up to the boat, the flip-flop had kind of come up around my ankle, and I was really bummed because those were my favorite flip-flops. You know, I'd blown out my flip-flop. I'm glad I didn't step on a pop-top. But being stuck in the mud is not a fun experience, and it's when you're stuck in the mud, you can't move the way that you're designed to move. You can't be the way that you were designed to be. And what I know is that was not the first time that I had been stuck in the mud, and it wouldn't be the last time that I will be stuck in the mud. Because the truth is, we get stuck all the time. We get stuck in the way that we view the world. We get stuck in the way that we perceive people. We get stuck in ways of thinking and ways of behaving that keep us from actually breaking out and experiencing new things. We get so stuck in our ways and so stuck in our thoughts that it prevents us from really embracing all of what life can be. And the thing of it is that being stuck in the mud, to get unstuck requires a lot of energy. It takes a lot of energy to get unstuck. And so what a lot of us do as we get stuck mentally and stuck emotionally and stuck spiritually is we just sort of give up because it would take too much energy to get unstuck. But how can a person who is created to worship God with their whole life and follow Jesus with their whole life, how can a person do that when they're stuck? Because God is not stuck, and God did not create us to be stuck. Today is Easter. It is a celebration of the resurrection, and today, stuckness gets confronted. Today, all stuckness gets challenged. We remember together today that Jesus was born to a virgin named Mary in a little town called Bethlehem, and he was raised in an even smaller town called Nazareth by Mary and her husband Joseph. And when he grew up, he ended up leaving Nazareth and he went to Galilee, and he began teaching and preaching and healing and feeding people and doing all these amazing things. And lots of people started to follow him wherever he went. They were amazed by what he was doing and the things that he was saying. They saw in him something that told them that he had a truth that was real, and they wanted to hear more of it. But all the time that he was preaching and teaching and healing and traveling through the land, and people were following him, and his crowds were getting larger and larger, there was another group of people, the religiously powerful, the ones that were in charge of things. They didn't like it. They didn't like how he was gaining such popularity, and they didn't like the things that he was saying. Because while they were preaching and teaching that you needed to follow all 613 laws, he was preaching grace. And while they were preaching about making sure you cross your T's and dot your I's, he was preaching about the love of God. And while they were doing everything they could to keep the peace, he was preaching that we are here to make peace with God and with each other. And so they had to eliminate him. They decided that the best thing to do for everybody would be to just get rid of him. And so they had him crucified. And so on a Friday afternoon, he was nailed to a cross where he hung and he died. And when he had died, there was a man named Joseph of Arimathea who came and who took Jesus' body down from the cross, and he carried his body to a tomb, and he laid him on a bench. He wrapped his body in linen, and then he rolled a stone in front of the tomb. And while he was doing this, there were women who had witnessed Jesus' crucifixion, and they had watched where Joseph had taken his body. And they had to be just grieving, just the deepest kind of grief that a person can, because they watched his ministry grow. They watched him gain popularity. Their lives were touched. And then to see him die like that. He was crucified on a Friday. That's day one. And when the sun went down, Sabbath began. And that's day two. And so the whole rest of the next day of what we call Saturday was Sabbath. And during Sabbath, nobody is allowed to do anything. You're not allowed to work. You're not allowed to sell anything or buy anything. And so the women who knew that his body had not been anointed properly because there wasn't enough time on Friday to do it before Sabbath began, they were unable to do anything. But when the sun went down on Saturday, they then went and they bought the spices and the things that they needed to anoint his body. The markets all open and back up when the sun goes down because it's no longer Sabbath. And so on the third day, they actually buy the spices because the third day begins at sundown. The next morning, because it was too dark to go and actually do anything, the next morning they gather up the spices, they gather up the things that they need to anoint his body for burial, and they go and they take it to the tomb. And presumably this tomb was like most of the tombs of that era among Jewish people. The custom was that there would be a small room that would be carved into a rock, somewhat like a cave. And in that cave there would be a bench that was carved out of the stone where a body could be laid and anointed and then prepared for burial. Then the body would be slid into an alcove. There were several alcoves in most of these tombs, and they would slide the body into that alcove, and then they would seal the door off and leave the body in there until it had fully decomposed. Then they would go back into the tomb sometime later, and they would take the bones, and they would place the bones into a stone box called an ossuary. And that ossuary would be what they held in memoriam. And so the women come that day with all the spices and everything, and they're going to anoint his body to kind of finish what Joseph had begun. And as they're going there, they start to talk to each other, and they recognize, wait a second, how are we going to move that stone? I mean, it's a big, heavy stone that got rolled in front of the tomb. And when they get there, guess what? The stone is rolled back. The door to the tomb is open. And so they step inside to look, because this is a little bit perplexing. And they look inside, and in there is a young man dressed in white. And he's dazzling white. And he speaks to them, and he says, You are looking for Jesus. He is not here. He is risen. Go, tell the disciples and Peter to meet him in Galilee. And so he says, and it's interesting that this angelic being says, tell the disciples and Peter. And the reason for that is because Jesus and Peter had a falling out. So that's their little issue. They'll deal with that later. But he tells them, Jesus is not here. He is risen. Go and tell. Go and tell the disciples. Now, what's really, really interesting is that the very oldest manuscripts that we have of the Gospel of Mark end by saying the women left the tomb in fear and amazement, and they said nothing to anyone. Period. End of Gospel. The oldest manuscripts end by saying they left and they said nothing to anyone. Now, some newer manuscripts add on an ending, but let's just say the story ended right there. Why would it end right there? Why would it end with the women leaving the tomb and saying nothing to anyone? Maybe it's because Mark wants for us to identify with the women and ask ourselves the question, having encountered the good news of the resurrection, will we also turn away and say nothing? Will we turn and say nothing? Are we so stuck in a worldview that says that resurrection does not happen, people don't come back from the dead, that we will leave and say nothing? Are we so stuck in a mindset that says unless I can see it, taste it, hear it, feel it, smell it, it doesn't exist? The beauty is, the good news is, it is actually the resurrection that frees us from our stuckness. When we take the step through the threshold of faith and we decide, I believe in the resurrection, I believe in the hope of the resurrection, now we can be unstuck. If we want to be freed from being stuck, the key is the resurrection. The resurrection is what frees us into a whole new life. It frees us from being stuck in the mud. There's an image I want to share with you that might come as a surprise. I see it as an image of the resurrection, and it is actually the space shuttle. I'm going to share with you some facts. My dad gave me these facts because he worked for NASA, and he shared some of these facts with me, and I'm going to share them with you. Did you know the shuttle goes from 0 to 17,000 miles per hour in 8.5 minutes? Did you know that one of the shuttle's main engines, now there are 3 main engines on the orbiter, and then there is a main fuel tank, and then there are 2 solid rocket boosters. Am I getting that right, Dad? And that makes up what we call the shuttle. And so on these 3 main engines, one of those main engines that's on the orbiter is 1/7 the weight of a train engine, but it is 39 times more powerful in horsepower. The 3 orbiter main engines deliver the horsepower, the 3 together deliver the horsepower of not 1, not 2, but 23 Hoover dams. 23 Hoover dams makes up the 3 orbiter main engines. If you tried to figure out how many Corvettes it would take to match the horsepower of the space shuttle, it is 120,000 Corvettes. 120,000 Corvettes equals 1 space shuttle. And the 2 solid rocket motors firing for 2 minutes could power 87,000 homes for a whole day. The space shuttle is incredibly powerful. But what's so amazing to me is that the space shuttle on the launch pad is held down by just 8 bolts. There are 8 bolts that are welded to the launch pad, and the space shuttle is dropped onto those 8 bolts. And then there are 8 nuts that bolt it down. And I happen to have one of those nuts. Isn't that nuts? Anyway, this is one of the nuts, and this is an actual one. It flew on STS-93, which launched on July 23rd, 1999. And these 8 nuts are what hold the space shuttle down. So the space shuttle fires up and goes, but what bolts it down are these nuts. And there are these little holes right here. Can you see those right there? Those would have explosives in them. So all 8 of these have these 2 explosives. And at just the right time, when they're ready for it to happen, they explode the nuts. And the nuts break open, and that frees the space shuttle to take off, to go to see all kinds of incredible things. And so it's like the resurrection, because these nuts break open to set the space shuttle free. The resurrection breaks open what is possible for you and me in our life. The resurrection, it breaks open the fullness of life that is available to us. When Jesus was raised from the dead, he broke open the possibility of life eternal. He canceled the power of sin and death so that we are no longer stuck, but we are freed to a whole new life. So we hear that news, and the question is, are we gonna be so stuck to just leave from hearing that news to say nothing? Or will we allow that news to shape who we are and shape what our life is all about? This morning, our confirmands, who are sitting right in this section right here, these confirmands have been on a journey together. They've been studying the faith, and they are going to come and they are going to proclaim their faith before all of you, and they're going to make commitments about being a faithful member of Christ Church. The thing about the space shuttle, guys, is that the space shuttle launch is not the conclusion, is it? When the space shuttle launches, it is just the beginning. The mission of the space shuttle has just begun when it takes off. The resurrection for us is not the conclusion of the story. It is the beginning. It is an invitation into a whole new life. It is an invitation into a mission. And your confirmation this morning is the same. This is not the conclusion of your experience. This is the beginning of your experience. Don't be like those confirmands who go through confirmation and walk away from it and just kind of do nothing with it. My prayer for all of you and my prayer for your parents is that when you guys take the vows, that it really initiates a whole new mission in your life. The resurrection breaks open all kinds of possibilities. Let's be people who accept the freedom and the power that God gives us to have a life that is full of life. Let's be the people of God who are no longer stuck, no longer held down, but set free to be the people that God has always dreamed for us to be. Amen.